one of the interesting things I've heard that you were talking about is that we need to kind of rethink about the way we measure inflation, or rethink about the way that we calculate the Phillips curve. How do you see that?
So the analogy I used in my comments was, since we're in Portugal, back to the days of Prince Henry the Navigator. He relied heavily on an astrolabe to guide his ships. And what would he have done if the astrolabe kept over-predicting the latitude where his ships were? Do you throw away the instrument? Do you just sail by gut, sail by the wind and landmarks? Or do you try to fix the instrument to make it work? And what I argued is we need to try to fix our models for understanding inflation. They haven't been working terribly well. Like Prince Henry and his astrolabe, they've been over-predicting the return of inflation, which hasn't happened. But I show some evidence that what we need to do is take better account of what's going on in the global economy. Our models have been too focused just on the domestic economy, domestic slack, and expect that to explain inflationary trends. But globalization has proceeded. We're now a much more integrated global economy. So whatever country you're in, you can't just look at domestic variables to explain inflation. You need to account for the rest of the world.
I did think this morning Mario Draghi spoke, and he seemed to be, in a sense, he seemed to be thinking of Europe almost as in a vacuum and not as interrelated as it is. Do you think that's one of the reasons we haven't seen the convergence that the ECB seems to have so much confidence in?
I think the euro area, as well as the U.S., as well as smaller economies, do need to better account for what's going on in the rest of the world. But I also, part of the discussion today was trying to understand what is happening to underlying inflation. And I showed some graphs which suggest that even though headline CPI inflation is starting to pick up, some of that is temporary effects of oil prices. And there still is a lack of underlying inflationary pressures. So there still is work to be done in countries such as the euro area. But some of that in countries such as the euro area, what the ECB is focused on, is there is still slack in the economy. There is still room for unemployment to fall, more workers to get jobs. And that's back to the old models. You don't need any new explanations to get at that.
Well, and they're so focused here. I mean, they're by law focused on price sensitivity in Europe, whereas Larry Summers was saying yesterday he's urging central bankers to look more at the labor market, to look more at job growth. Do you think, you know, with all of these changes being suggested by you and by Professor Dr. Summers, do you think anyone taking that to heart? Are they going to actually change the way they do business as central bankers?
I think one lesson we have learned that relates to what Larry Summers was saying and to what Draghi was saying is that we don't have a great estimate of what exactly is the NAIRU, the natural rate of unemployment after which inflation accelerates rapidly. I think we all know to be cautious. We don't have that magic number. So we do need to look at other indicators. We do need to be modest in terms of what we do know. And we do need to look at, again, a broader set of indicators. So I think there is general agreement. And that's what I got from Draghi's speech, was that he is looking at broader indicators. There's no number. We need to see how data develops and how the economy fills in relative to their forecasts.
If NAIRU is less than 3.9%, then the U.S. definitely needs to find a new way to measure unemployment. What do you think?
But actually, on that, there was some interesting discussion today of there are different ways to measure unemployment. In the U.S., one particular problem is participation. Unemployment is only the people who are actively participating in the labor market who then can't find work. But there's a lot of people who've dropped out of the labor force. So you probably should bring them in as you measure slack in economies.
What do you think about the idea that Summers was encouraging? Don't worry about inflation, maybe especially if you don't necessarily think it's measured the right way, and keep a monetary policy accommodative. Does that hold true for the big economies in the world?
So I would take a slightly different approach, is I would say maybe not to worry so much about that headline CPI inflation if, say, example, is driven by a spike in oil prices that might go away or that might fade out of the index. I would instead argue we should focus more on underlying trend inflation, core inflation, what those price pressures are that will persist. And that would be a better way to focus monetary policy.
But on the other hand, what do you think about asset bubbles? Are you concerned about that with such accommodative monetary policy?
Yeah. So I think about accommodative monetary policy has benefits. It spurs growth, gets people back to work, but it has costs, and you have to constantly balance that. But if you have an economy that still needs stimulus, still could get people back to work, still could grow faster, and you are worried about housing price bubbles and asset price bubbles, then the appropriate tool is to use macroprudential policy.